morning air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of pine and frost, as Frank Miller, a retired mechanic in his early 60s, hammered the final nails into his handcrafted wooden reindeer. The small-town streets of Hillside were quiet, save for the occasional sound of a neighbor's leaf blower or the bark of a distant dog. December was in full swing, and Christmas decorations had become a fierce yet friendly competition among the residents. Frank stood back, wiping his hands on his jeans, and admired his work. His house, a modest two-story tucked at the end of the cul-de-sac, was almost ready to be unveiled as the neighborhood's crown jewel. Twinkling lights wrapped around the porch railings, a glowing nativity scene illuminated the front yard, and his pièce de resistance, a towering inflatable Santa, stood proudly beside the driveway. But there was one final touch Frank had been saving, a small addition he knew would set his display apart. A bright red and white poster reading, "Make America Great Again." Frank wasn't just a lover of Christmas. He was a man of deep principles. A father of 3 and a grandfather of 5, he had lived in Hillside for nearly 3 decades. He'd always been known as the guy who could fix anything, from a leaky faucet to a sputtering engine. Over the years, his neighbors had grown used to his bold personality. He spoke his mind, wore his heart on his sleeve, and never shied away from sharing his opinions, even when they were rent popular. This year, Frank had decided to incorporate his values into his Christmas display. For him, the MAGA slogan wasn't about division or confrontation, it was about pride. Christmas is about family, unity, and tradition, he'd said to his wife, Linda, over breakfast that morning. What better time to remind folks about the values that made this country great, Linda, ever the voice of reason, had raised an eyebrow. Frank, you know not everyone's going to see it that way. He'd waved her off with a chuckle. It's my yard, my decorations. Besides, it's just a sign. People either love it or leave it. The cul-de-sac was a patchwork of personalities, each household bringing its own flavor to the street. There was Carol, the retired school teacher, whose yard was always a winter wonderland of snowflakes and icicle lights. Next door was the younger couple, Mike and Jenna, who opted for a sleek, modern display of blue and silver LEDs. Then there was Dave, the grumpy neighbor who rarely bothered with decorations, but never missed a chance to complain about the ones that didn't meet his standards. Across the street lived Sharon, an outspoken advocate for local causes. Sharon was known for organizing bake sales, attending town hall meetings, and voicing her disapproval when things didn't align with her values. Her house, decorated with environmentally friendly lights and a hand-painted Peace on Earth banner, stood in sharp contrast to Frank's brightly lit extravaganza. Sharon and Frank had always maintained a polite but strained relationship. She found his views outdated, while he considered her opinions overly idealistic. Still, they'd managed to coexist peacefully, until now. Frank had just finished securing the poster to the front of his porch when Sharon walked by with her golden retriever, Max. She paused, her eyes narrowing as she took in the sight of the MAGA poster flanked by candy canes and twinkling lights. "Really, Frank?" she called out, her tone dripping with incredulity. Frank turned, flashing her a broad grin. "Merry Christmas to you too, Sharon." She shook her head, muttering something under her breath as she walked away. Frank chuckled to himself, brushing it off as just another one of Sharon's gripes. But he underestimated just how much of a spark his sign had ignited. By evening, whispers had begun circulating among the neighbors. Some were supportive, others were indifferent, but a vocal few, led by Sharon, were less than pleased. Messages flew back and forth in the neighborhood group chat, where Sharon voiced her concerns about politics invading the holiday spirit. Politics invading the holiday spirit. "We should be celebrating unity, not dividing our community," she wrote. Mike chimed in, trying to play peacemaker. "It's just a sign, Sharon. Let's not blow this out of proportion." But Sharon wasn't having it. "It's not about the sign, Mike. It's about the message it sends." By the time the sun had set, tensions on the street were as bright as the Christmas lights. The next morning, Frank woke to the sound of his doorbell ringing insistently. He opened it to find 2 uniformed police officers standing on his porch, their expressions serious. "Mr. Miller," one of them began, "we received a call about your Christmas display." Frank's brow furrowed. "A call? About my decorations?" The officer nodded. Your sign, specifically, one of your neighbors filed a complaint, citing it as a disturbance. Frank's initial confusion gave way to disbelief. You've got to be kidding me. It's a sign on my property. The second officer held up a hand. We're not here to cause trouble, sir. We're just following up on the complaint. If there's no violation, we'll leave it at that. Frank gestured toward the sign. It's within the HOA guidelines. Nothing offensive, nothing obscene. Just a Christmas decoration with a message. The officers exchanged a glance, then nodded. As long as it doesn't violate any ordinances, you're within your rights. Have a good day, sir. As the officers walked away, Frank stood on his porch, hands on his hips, watching them leave. His resolve hardened. He wasn't about to let anyone tell him how to decorate his home. Inside, Linda gave him a knowing look. Well, you've done it now, Frank. He grinned, though the tension in his eyes betrayed his confidence. I'll be damned if I let anyone ruin Christmas for me. End of section 1. What do you think of this start? Should I adjust anything before moving to the next section? The air in Hillside seemed heavier in the days following the police visit. Frank carried on with his usual routine, hanging lights, adjusting the nativity scene, and inflating Santa when the wind knocked him over. But he couldn't ignore the sidelong glances from neighbors passing by. Even Linda, typically his voice of reason, had grown quieter. Over dinner, she'd finally broached the topic again. Frank, maybe you should think about taking the sign down, just for the sake of peace. Frank put down his fork, his eyes narrowing slightly. Peace? I'm not bothering anyone. It's a free country. I served this country so I could do things like this, and I'm not backing down because Sharon doesn't like my decorations. Linda sighed, knowing there was no convincing him once his mind was made up. Just don't let this get out of hand, Frank. Christmas is supposed to be about joy, not feuds. But for Frank, the sign wasn't just a decoration. It was a symbol of his beliefs, his pride, and, perhaps most importantly, his right to express himself. The neighborhood buzzed with chatter about Frank's sign. Carol, the retired schoolteacher, was one of the few who defended him publicly. He's not hurting anyone, she told a group of neighbors during a morning walk. It's his yard. If we start policing Christmas decorations, where does it end? Others weren't so forgiving. Sharon, of course, was leading the charge, rallying the neighborhood group chat with increasingly fiery messages. It's not about the sign, she insisted during a backyard gathering. It's about the principle. We shouldn't mix politics with Christmas. It's divisive. Mike, ever the peacemaker, tried to find common ground. Sharon, it's just a sign. Let's focus on what really matters. Decorating for the block's Christmas light contest. Oh, but Sharon wasn't having it. This is what matters, Mike. If we don't stand up for our community values, who will? The block soon became a patchwork of silent allegiances. Some neighbors avoided Frank's house entirely, crossing the street when walking their dogs. Others gave him a thumbs up or a quiet word of support. It was a chilly Wednesday evening when the tension finally reached its boiling point. Frank had just finished setting up an elaborate elf workshop in his front yard, a miniature display complete with toy tools, tiny glowing lanterns, and mechanical elves that moved back and forth. The entire yard was a spectacle of holiday cheer, and despite the brewing conflict, Frank was proud of his work. Linda called him in for dinner, and as he sat down to eat, the faint sound of voices outside caught his attention. At first he ignored it, figuring it was just a group of kids admiring his display. But then, a loud crash echoed through the night. Frank bolted to the window, his heart pounding. One of the wooden reindeer he'd crafted was lying on its side, its head broken clean off. Nearby, a small group of teenagers scattered, their laughter fading into the darkness as they ran. "Damn it," Frank muttered, grabbing his jacket. "Frank, let it go," Linda called after him. But he was already out the door. He stood in the yard, surveying the damage. The reindeer could be repaired, but it wasn't just about the decoration. It was about the principle. Someone had crossed a line. The next morning he filed a report with the local police. The officers were polite but non-committal. "We'll keep an eye on things, Mr. Miller," one of them said, though Frank could tell they didn't see it as a priority. But for Frank, this wasn't over. The incident only fueled Sharon's crusade. "This is exactly what I was warning about," she said during a neighborhood meeting at Carol's house. "The sign is attracting the wrong kind of attention. It's causing division and now vandalism." Carol shook her head. "Sharon, the kids who did this aren't protesting a political message. They're just being punks. Blaming Frank isn't fair." Sharon crossed her arms. "It's not about fairness. It's about responsibility. He put up that sign knowing it would stir up controversy." Despite Carol's protests, Sharon convinced a handful of neighbors to sign a petition asking Frank to remove the sign. She even went door to door, though not everyone was receptive. "I'm not signing that," Mike said firmly when she showed up at his doorstep. "It's a Christmas decoration, Sharon. We're not living in a dictatorship." Sharon left without a word, but her frustration was evident. When Frank heard about the petition, he was livid. He stood on his porch, glaring at Sharon's house across the street, where she was hosting a small gathering. "If they think a piece of paper is going to make me back down, they've got another thing coming," he muttered to Linda. To make his point, Frank added a string of spotlights to illuminate the MAGA sign at night. It shone brighter than ever, visible from every angle of the street. Linda sighed, shaking her head. "You're just throwing gasoline on the fire, Frank." "Let it burn," he replied. The following evening, the police returned, this time responding to multiple noise complaints about the spotlights. Frank stood on his porch, arms crossed as the officers explained the situation. "They're not noisy," Frank argued. "They're lights," the lead officer sighed. "Technically, yes, but they're bright enough to be considered a nuisance. We're asking you to tone it down," Frank reluctantly agreed, but as soon as the officers left, he muttered under his breath, "This is ridiculous. This is ridiculous." As the annual Christmas light contest approached, the tension in the neighborhood reached its peak. Frank was determined to win, not just for the trophy, but to make a statement. Sharon, meanwhile, was rallying her supporters to ensure Frank's display didn't take the prize. The night of the judging, families gathered on the sidewalk, sipping hot cocoa as they admired the displays. Frank's house was a beacon of holiday spirit, his decorations dazzling despite the controversy. But as the judges approached his yard, a small group of protesters, organized by Sharon, stood across the street holding signs that read, "Keep politics out of Christmas" and "Unity over division." Frank stood on his porch, his jaw clenched as he watched the scene unfold. The judges, visibly uncomfortable, quickly moved on to the next house. When the winners were announced the next day, Frank wasn't surprised to hear that Mike and Jenna's modern display had taken first place. Sharon's house came in second. Frank's name wasn't even mentioned. But while the official results were a blow, Frank found solace in the handful of neighbors who stopped by to show their support. "You were robbed," Carol said, handing him a plate of cookies. Frank smiled, though the fire in his eyes hadn't dimmed. "Thanks, Carol. But it's not about the trophy. It's about standing up for what you believe in." The days following the Christmas light contest were strangely quiet. The usual hum of neighborhood life felt subdued, as though everyone was waiting to see what would happen next. Frank, stubborn as ever, kept his display intact. The MAGA sign shone just as brightly as his candy cane arches, standing as a defiant symbol of his principles. But not everyone was content to let things simmer. Carol, the retired teacher, had been quietly observing the feud and decided it was time to step in. One crisp afternoon, she knocked on Frank's door. He opened it, surprised to see her holding a thermos and a tin of cookies. "Afternoon, Frank," she said with a warm smile. "Mind if I come in?" Frank hesitated for a moment, then stepped aside. "Sure, Carol. What's on your mind?" They sat in the living room, the soft glow of Christmas lights spilling in from the yard. Carol poured them each a cup of coffee from the thermos. "Frank," she began, "I know you mean well. I know that sign represents something important to you. But this fight with Sharon, it's tearing the neighborhood apart." Frank set his coffee down, his brow furrowing. "I didn't start this, Carol. She did. I'm just standing my ground." "I know," Carol said gently, "and I respect that. But sometimes, standing your ground doesn't mean digging in deeper. It means finding a way to bridge the gap." Frank leaned back in his chair, the weight of the past week settling on his shoulders. He was tired of the conflict, but the idea of conceding felt like betraying his values. "What do you suggest?" he asked. Carol smiled. "Why don't we organize something together? A way to bring the community back together. Show them that we can celebrate Christmas and respect each other's differences." Carol's idea took shape quickly. She proposed a neighborhood Christmas potluck, a chance for everyone to come together, share food, and leave their grievances at the door. At first, Frank was skeptical. "You really think Sharon's going to agree to this?" Carol nodded confidently. "She will. I'll make sure of it." True to her word, Carol approached Sharon the next day. It took some convincing, but eventually, Sharon agreed, albeit reluctantly. "If it means we can move past this, I'm willing to try," Sharon said, though her tone was less than enthusiastic. With the potluck set for Christmas Eve, Carol and Frank threw themselves into organizing. Frank even offered to host it in his yard, much to Linda's amusement. "Well," she said with a laugh, "at least you're consistent." Christmas Eve arrived with a blanket of fresh snow, covering the neighborhood in a pristine white layer. Frank's yard had been transformed into a gathering space, with long tables set up under strings of fairy lights. Neighbors arrived carrying dishes of every kind: casseroles, cookies, pies, and more. Despite the festive atmosphere, a lingering tension hung in the air. Sharon stood at one end of the yard, chatting with her supporters, while Frank held court at the other, a cup of hot cider in hand. Carol took it upon herself to break the ice. She moved between groups, introducing people, sharing stories, and gradually coaxing smiles from even the most skeptical attendees. As the night wore on, the mood began to shift. Laughter replaced hushed whispers, and the aroma of warm food filled the air. Even Frank and Sharon found themselves standing at the same table, their conversation initially awkward but slowly warming. "You've got a nice spread here," Sharon admitted, gesturing to the buffet. Frank chuckled. "Well, I figured if I'm going to have the whole neighborhood in my yard, I might as well feed them." Sharon smiled faintly. "Maybe I've been a little stubborn about all this." Frank raised an eyebrow. "You don't say." They both laughed, the tension between them finally easing. As the potluck wound down, Carol gathered everyone around for a toast. She raised her glass, her voice warm and steady. "This year, we've seen our share of disagreements," she began, her gaze sweeping over the crowd. "But tonight, we've come together to celebrate what really matters: family, friendship, and the spirit of Christmas. Let's carry that spirit into the new year and remember that, despite our differences, we're all neighbors." The crowd erupted into applause, glasses clinking as everyone toasted to the sentiment. By the end of the night, Frank and Sharon had reached a quiet truce. While they didn't agree on everything, they'd found common ground in their shared love for their community. As Frank stood on his porch, watching the last of the neighbors leave, Linda joined him, wrapping a scarf around her shoulders. "Looks like you've made peace," she said. Frank nodded, a small smile playing on his lips. "Yeah. Feels good, doesn't it?" Linda squeezed his arm. "It does." Christmas morning dawned quietly in Hillside, the snow from the previous night now glistening under the pale winter sun. Frank stood by the window, a steaming mug of coffee in hand, watching the light bounce off the icicles hanging from the eaves. The neighborhood felt different today, calmer, as though the potluck had swept away some of the tension that had gripped it for weeks. Linda appeared behind him, placing a hand on his shoulder. "What's on your mind?" she asked gently. Frank shrugged, his lips curving into a faint smile. "Just thinking about last night. It felt good, like the old days." Linda chuckled. "It's amazing what a little food and conversation can do." Frank turned to her, his expression more serious. "You were right, you know. This whole thing, it got out of hand. I didn't mean for it to become such a big deal." Linda squeezed his arm. "You were just standing up for what you believe in, Frank. But sometimes it's worth standing down a little to keep the peace." Across the street, Sharon was having a similar moment of reflection. She sat at her kitchen table, Max curled up at her feet, scrolling through photos from the potluck on her phone. Her husband, Greg, entered the room, holding 2 cups of tea. "You're quiet this morning," he said, setting one down in front of her. Sharon sighed, looking up at him. "I was thinking about Frank. For all his stubbornness, he's not a bad guy." Greg smirked. "You just figuring that out now?" She rolled her eyes but couldn't suppress a smile. "I guess I let my frustration get the better of me. He's not wrong to be proud of what he believes in. I just wish he'd been less loud about it." Greg leaned against the counter, watching her. "It's not always easy to agree with your neighbors, but last night was a good reminder that we're all on the same street, so to speak." Sharon nodded, her resolve softening. "Well, maybe it's time I focus on what brings us together, instead of what divides us." Over the next few days, the signs of the truce between Frank and Sharon began to show. Frank replaced the bright spotlights illuminating his MAGA sign with a softer string of fairy lights, making it less conspicuous. Sharon, for her part, stopped rallying the neighbors against him and instead began waving to Frank whenever she passed by his house. It wasn't a complete transformation, but it was a start. Carol, ever the optimist, couldn't help but feel proud as she walked her usual morning route and saw the changes. "Small steps," she muttered to herself with a satisfied smile. The sense of community that had been reignited at the potluck carried through into the new year. Neighbors who had previously avoided each other began stopping to chat during walks or at the mailbox. Even Dave, the perennial grump of the block, seemed to lighten up. One morning as he walked past Frank's yard, he paused to admire the now snow-covered decorations. "Nice setup," he said gruffly, tipping his hat. Frank grinned. "Thanks, Dave. Took a lot of work." Dave nodded, then added, "Could have done without the sign, though." Frank laughed. "Fair enough." One afternoon, Frank found himself in his garage, packing away the Christmas decorations. As he wrapped the nativity figures in newspaper, he thought about everything that had happened. He didn't regret putting up the MAGA sign. It was an expression of who he was, but he did regret how much it had escalated, how it had affected his relationships with his neighbors. Linda appeared in the doorway, leaning against the frame. "You're thinking again," she teased. Frank chuckled, setting down a box, just trying to make sense of it all. "Figure anything out?" she asked. "Yeah," he said after a moment. "I figure that people are complicated. We all want the same things, really. Happiness, respect, a sense of belonging. We just go about it differently." Linda smiled, stepping closer. And Frank continued, "Maybe I don't need a sign to say what I believe. Maybe living it is enough." Sharon, too, found herself reflecting on the lessons of the past few weeks. On New Year's Eve, she stood in her living room, writing in her journal by the light of the fireplace. Her resolution was simple. Focus on building, not dividing. Seek to understand, not to argue. She smiled to herself, knowing it wouldn't be easy, but feeling ready to try. On New Year's Day, Frank was surprised to find Sharon at his door, a small gift bag in hand. "Happy New Year," she said, her tone genuine. Frank raised an eyebrow but accepted the bag. Inside was a jar of homemade jam and a card that read, "To new beginnings, Sharon." "Thanks, Sharon," Frank said, touched. "This means a lot." She nodded. "We're neighbors, Frank. We may not always agree, but I think we can still respect each other." "Agreed," Frank said, extending a hand. They shook, a simple gesture that carried more weight than either of them realized. As the weeks passed, the neighborhood seemed to settle into a new rhythm. Frank and Sharon still had their differences, but they'd found a way to coexist, even occasionally sharing a laugh or a friendly chat. For Frank, the experience had been a reminder of the importance of standing up for what you believe in, but also of the value in listening and finding common ground. As he stood on his porch one evening, looking out over the quiet street, he felt a sense of peace he hadn't in months. "It's a good neighborhood," he said aloud, his breath visible in the cold air. And for the first time in a long while, he believed it. In the weeks that followed, Frank began noticing small opportunities to contribute to the neighborhood in quieter ways. He offered to help Carol repair her sagging fence, which had taken a hit during a recent snowstorm. For Mike and Jenna, He volunteered to install a new set of outdoor lights they had been struggling with. These gestures weren't grand, nor were they accompanied by his usual boldness. Instead, they were quiet acts of goodwill that spoke volumes to those who had once seen him as stubborn or combative. One chilly morning, as Frank shoveled snow off his driveway, Dave stopped by, leaning on his cane. "You know," Dave began, his voice gruff, "I used to think you were all bark and no bite, but you've got a decent heart under all that noise." Frank laughed, leaning on his shovel. "Coming from you, Dave, that's high praise." The two men shared a rare chuckle before Dave shuffled off, leaving Frank with a sense of satisfaction he hadn't felt in weeks. Inspired by the potluck success, Sharon took it upon herself to launch a new neighborhood initiative. She called it Hillside Cares, a program aimed at organizing volunteer efforts within the community, clearing driveways for elderly residents, collecting donations for the local food bank, and hosting monthly coffee mornings to strengthen bonds among neighbors. Initially, Sharon was hesitant to involve Frank, unsure of how he'd react to her initiative, but to her surprise, he offered to help the moment he heard about it. "If you're serious about helping the community, count me in," Frank said one afternoon, catching Sharon as she stapled a flyer to the community board near the park. She blinked at him, taken aback. "You'd really want to be a part of this?" Frank nodded. "Look, we're not always going to see eye to eye, but we're still neighbors, and neighbors look out for each other." That day marked a turning point in their relationship. While they weren't exactly friends, they had found a mutual respect that went beyond their differences. The first big event under the Hillside Cares banner was a neighborhood cleanup day. On a brisk Saturday morning, residents gathered at the park, armed with gloves, trash bags, and rakes. Frank and Sharon found themselves working side by side, clearing out a patch of overgrown weeds near the playground. "You know," Sharon said as she tugged at a particularly stubborn root, "I never thought I'd see the day when we'd be working together." Frank smirked, tossing a pile of leaves into a bag. "Stranger things have happened." Nearby, Carol snapped a picture of the two, grinning. "This one's going in the newsletter," she called out, earning groans from both Frank and Sharon. Despite the initial awkwardness, the day was a resounding success. By the end of it, the park looked pristine, and the residents celebrated with hot cocoa and cookies provided by Carol and Linda. The positive momentum from the cleanup day seemed to breathe new life into Hillside. Neighbors who had once been distant began to reconnect. Children played together more often, their laughter ringing through the streets. Even Frank's house, once the epicenter of controversy, became a gathering spot for casual chats and impromptu snowball fights. One afternoon, Mike and Jenna stopped by with their baby, bundled up in a puffy snowsuit. "We wanted to thank you for helping with our lights," Jenna said, handing Frank a small tin of homemade cookies. Frank waved it off. "Happy to help. You two make the best cookies on the block anyway. Consider an even trade." In the midst of the neighborhood's revival, Frank was surprised to find Police Chief Harper at his door one evening. "Chief," Frank said, stepping aside to let him in, "to what do I owe the honor?" Harper, a tall man with a kind face, smiled. "Relax, Frank. I'm not here on official business. I just wanted to check in. Word around town is that things have quieted down here on the cul-de-sac." Frank chuckled, leading Harper to the kitchen. Yeah, you could say that. Sharon and I have been playing nice. It's a Christmas miracle." The chief laughed, sipping the coffee Linda handed him. "I'm glad to hear it, but I'll admit, your sign caused quite the stir at the station." "We don't usually get complaints about Christmas decorations," Frank grinned. "Well, Chief, I like to keep things interesting." Harper leaned back in his chair, his expression turning thoughtful. "You know, Frank, what you did, standing up for yourself, it's something a lot of people wouldn't have the courage to do. But finding common ground afterward, that's even harder. You've got my respect." Frank nodded, feeling a swell of pride. "Thanks, Chief. I just hope we can keep it that way." As winter deepened, the cul-de-sac grew quieter, the neighborhood basking in the glow of renewed unity. One snowy evening, Frank stood on his porch, Gazing at the decorations still twinkling in the yards around him, Linda joined him, slipping her arm through his. "You've done good, Frank," she said softly. Frank tilted his head, smiling down at her. "We've done good. I couldn't have gotten through this without you." They stood in comfortable silence, watching the snow fall. Months later, long after the snow had melted and the decorations had been packed away, the spirit of community fostered during the holiday season endured. Hillside Cares became a cornerstone of the neighborhood, with new initiatives springing up every month. Frank and Sharon, once adversaries, became unlikely allies in maintaining the neighborhood's harmony. They still disagreed on plenty, but those disagreements no longer defined their relationship. As Frank looked out over the blooming gardens of spring, he felt a sense of pride, not just in his home but in the community that had come together despite its differences. "We've got a good thing here," he said to Linda one afternoon. She smiled. "We always have, Frank. We just needed a little reminder." As spring rolled into summer, the peace in Hillside was tested once again. This time, it wasn't politics or holiday decorations, but a proposal for a new zoning development that threatened to disrupt the quiet charm of the neighborhood. A developer had submitted plans to build a set of modern townhomes at the edge of the cul-de-sac, replacing the small wooded area where children often played and families took evening strolls. The proposal quickly became the talk of the block, with residents splitting into factions. Those who supported the development for its potential to increase property values, and those who fiercely opposed it for threatening the neighborhood's character. Sharon, unsurprisingly, became the unofficial leader of the opposition, organizing meetings and circulating petitions. Frank, who initially had little interest in the matter, found himself drawn into the debate when Sharon approached him directly. "Frank," she said one afternoon as he worked on his truck in the driveway, "I know we've had our differences, but I need your help. You've got a way of getting people's attention." Frank raised an eyebrow, wiping his hands on a rag. "You want me to be your megaphone?" Sharon hesitated, then nodded. "Something like that? You're good at rallying people, and this is an issue that affects all of us." Frank leaned back against his truck, considering her words. He wasn't one to shy away from a cause, especially one that felt personal. The woods behind his house had been a source of solace for him over the years, a quiet escape where he could clear his mind. "All right," he said finally. "All right," he said finally. "But if I'm in, we're doing this my way. No drama, no division, just facts." Sharon smiled, a flicker of relief crossing her face. Deal. Frank and Sharon joined forces, an alliance that surprised and amused the rest of the neighborhood. Together, they hosted a town hall meeting in Frank's garage, inviting the developer to present their plans and giving residents a chance to voice their concerns. The turnout was better than anyone expected. Carol baked cookies, Mike set up folding chairs, and Linda brewed a massive pot of coffee. The room buzzed with energy as neighbors exchanged opinions and debated the proposal. Frank, true to his word, kept the discussion focused and respectful. When tempers flared, he stepped in with a firm but calm reminder: "We're here to solve problems, not create new ones." By the end of the night, a consensus had begun to form. While not everyone opposed the development, most agreed that it needed to be scaled back to preserve the wooded area and maintain the neighborhood's character. The next step was a presentation at City Hall, where Frank and Sharon found themselves working together once again. They spent hours preparing their arguments, gathering signatures, and organizing their thoughts into a compelling case. On the day of the meeting, they stood side by side at the podium, presenting their case to the zoning board. Frank spoke with passion, drawing on his years of experience advocating for his beliefs, while Sharon provided detailed, well-researched data to support their points. Their combined efforts paid off. The board agreed to revisit the plans, pushing the developer to make adjustments that would address the community's concerns. As they left the meeting, Sharon turned to Frank with a wry smile. "Not bad for a couple of stubborn old neighbors, huh?" Frank laughed. "Not bad at all." The success at City Hall solidified the newfound sense of unity in Hillside. The neighborhood celebrated with a summer block party, organized by Carol and Jenna. Frank manned the grill, flipping burgers and hot dogs with his usual flair, while Sharon helped set up games for the kids. As the evening wore on, Frank found himself sitting by the fire pit, a plate of food balanced on his lap. Sharon joined him, handing him a cold drink. "You know," she said, settling into the chair beside him, "I used to think you were impossible to work with." Frank grinned. "And now?" Sharon shrugged, a hint of a smile tugging at her lips. Sharon shrugged, tugging at her lips. "You're still impossible, but I can't deny you're good at bringing people together." Frank raised his drink in a mock toast. "Here's to being possible." They both laughed, the sound carrying into the warm summer night. Over time, Hillside became known not just as a picturesque neighborhood, but as a place where people genuinely looked out for one another. Hillside Cares expanded its reach, organizing larger initiatives like food drives, park cleanups, and even a mentorship program for local youth. Frank and Sharon, once the unlikeliest of allies, became a symbol of the neighborhood's resilience. They continued to butt heads occasionally. Frank's stubbornness and Sharon's insistence on perfection made that inevitable, but their disagreements were tempered by mutual respect. One day, as they stood together at a Hillside Cares fundraiser, a local reporter approached them for an interview. "What's your secret to building such a strong community?" the reporter asked. Frank and Sharon exchanged a look, then laughed. "Good neighbors," Frank said simply. "And a lot of patience," Sharon added with a smirk. As the seasons turned and the years went by, Hillside remained a vibrant and close-knit community. Frank, now a grandfather several times over, continued to play an active role in neighborhood life, mentoring younger residents and sharing his wisdom. Sharon, too, became a beloved figure in the community, her passion for advocacy channeled into projects that made Hillside a better place for everyone. And though the MAGA sign had long since been retired, its legacy lived on in a way Frank hadn't anticipated, not as a source of division, but as the spark that brought a neighborhood together. One sweltering August afternoon, Hillside faced a challenge greater than anything it had experienced in recent memory. A severe summer storm rolled through the region, bringing with it torrential rain, high winds, and power outages. By the time the storm passed, the neighborhood was left with fallen trees, flooded basements, and damage to several homes. Frank's property bore the brunt of the storm's wrath. His beloved truck was pinned beneath a massive oak, the once pristine front yard now a muddy mess of debris. "Looks like we've got some cleaning up to do," Frank muttered, trying to inject humor into the grim situation. Linda patted his shoulder. "We'll get through this, Frank. We always do." As the couple began assessing the damage, a knock on the door startled them. Frank opened it to find Sharon and Greg standing on the porch, raincoats dripping. "Thought you might need a hand," Sharon said, holding up a toolbox. Frank blinked, momentarily speechless. "We can get started on the tree," Greg added. Frank found his voice, a grateful smile spreading across his face. "I appreciate it. Thank you." Word of Frank's predicament spread quickly through the neighborhood, and by mid-morning, a small army of neighbors had descended on his yard, armed with chainsaws, rakes, and buckets. Mike and Jenna tackled the fallen tree, while Carol organized a team to clear debris. Even Dave showed up, grumbling about the heat but working diligently to help repair Frank's damaged fence. "This is what community's all about," Carol said, wiping sweat from her brow as she directed the cleanup effort. By the end of the day, the yard was unrecognizable, not from destruction, but from the incredible teamwork that had restored it. Frank stood in the center of the newly cleared space, his heart swelling with gratitude. "I don't know how to thank you all," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Sharon stepped forward, clapping him on the shoulder. "You don't have to, Frank. That's what neighbors are for." The storm's aftermath served as a catalyst for even greater collaboration within Hillside. As each household worked to repair its own damage, neighbors leaned on one another more than ever before. Frank spent the following days helping Sharon replant her garden, which had been flooded during the storm. In turn, Sharon rallied her Hillside Cares team to assist other residents with everything from patching roofs to clearing clogged gutters. By the time the neighborhood was fully restored, the bonds between its residents had grown stronger than ever. Hillside was no longer just a collection of houses. It was a true community. 1 year after the storm, Hillside held its first annual Unity Day, a celebration of the neighborhood's resilience and camaraderie. The event featured a barbecue, games for the kids, and a slideshow showcasing the community's journey from conflict to harmony. Frank, who had been asked to say a few words, stood at the microphone, looking out over the crowd. Families laughed and mingled, their differences forgotten in the spirit of the day. "I'll be honest," Frank began, his voice steady. "There was a time when I thought this neighborhood was falling apart. We let our disagreements get the better of us, and I wasn't exactly innocent in that. But you know what? We came back stronger. We learned that it's okay to have differences, as long as we remember what brings us together." The crowd erupted into applause, and Frank stepped down, feeling a sense of fulfillment he hadn't felt in years. As the sun set on Unity Day, Frank found himself sitting on his porch, watching the neighborhood settle into the evening. The streetlights flickered on, casting a warm glow over the cul-de-sac. Sharon joined him, holding 2 cups of cider. "Mind if I sit?" Frank gestured to the chair beside him. "Be my guest." They sat in companionable silence for a moment before Sharon spoke. "You know, I used to think we were too different to ever get along," Frank chuckled. "And now? Now I think our differences make us stronger," she said simply. Frank nodded, raising his cup. "To Hillside, to Hillside." Sharon echoed, clinking her cup against his. Years later, Hillside's story would become a model for other communities. Residents spoke proudly of their neighborhood, pointing to its ability to overcome challenges and celebrate diversity as proof of its strength. Frank and Sharon, once adversaries, became the heart of the neighborhood story, a reminder that even the most unlikely friendships can flourish with a little understanding and a lot of effort. And though the MAGA sign was long gone, its legacy remained, not as a source of division, but as the spark that brought a neighborhood together, forever transforming it into a beacon of unity. As the years passed, the once divided neighborhood of Hillside became a shining example of how even the deepest divides can be bridged with patience, understanding, and shared effort. The MAGA sign, which had been the catalyst for so much discord, was now a distant memory, replaced by a stronger, more united community. For Frank, the journey was one of personal growth. He had learned that standing up for what you believe in didn't mean refusing to listen to others. It meant finding ways to live out those beliefs without alienating those around you. The confrontation with Sharon had tested his patience, but in the end, it had forged a bond that he never expected. As he stood on his front porch one evening, watching children play in the street and neighbors chatting on their lawns, Frank couldn't help but feel a sense of fulfillment. Hillside had changed, and in many ways he had changed with it. Linda joined him on the porch, her hand resting gently on his arm. "You've come a long way, Frank," she said softly. Frank smiled, a quiet pride in his eyes. "We all have." Sharon, too, had evolved through the events of the past few years. Where once her views had been rigid and focused on division, she now found herself celebrating the diversity of opinions and backgrounds that made Hillside unique. She had learned to embrace conflict not as something to be avoided, but as an opportunity for growth and understanding. And as she sat in her living room, reflecting on the changes that had unfolded, she realized something profound. The strength of a community isn't measured by its homogeneity, but by its ability to come together despite differences. The storm, both literal and metaphorical, had forced Hillside to rebuild, but it had also strengthened the bonds between its residents, cementing their sense of unity. Hillside's transformation had become a story that was shared with pride among its residents. What had once been a collection of houses now stood as a thriving community, a place where people didn't just live next to one another, they cared for one another. The Hillside Cares initiative, which had started as a simple idea for a neighborhood cleanup, had grown into a full-fledged community service program that extended beyond the cul-de-sac's boundaries. Every year, the neighborhood would come together for a large charity event, and every month, groups of volunteers would head out to help neighboring communities in need. The once contentious gatherings now became regular fixtures in the neighborhood calendar. Whether it was a volunteer project, a block party, or simply a shared meal, Hillside had learned that togetherness wasn't about avoiding conflict. It was about coming together despite it. As Frank looked out over the familiar streets, he realized that the legacy of what they had built here wasn't in the signs or the decorations. It was in the relationships. Hillside had become a place where people could disagree and still sit down together over a cup of coffee. Where a MAGA sign, once a symbol of division, had transformed into a reminder of the power of dialogue, understanding, and respect. And it wasn't just about the neighbors in Hillside. It was about what they had learned and how they shared it with the world. Word spread about how Hillside had overcome its differences and rebuilt itself from the ground up. Visitors who had heard the story came from neighboring towns, eager to learn from Hillside's example. Unity, Frank said to Linda one evening, as they watched the sun set behind their home, isn't just a feeling. It's something you work for. It's something you have to build together. Linda nodded. And I think we've built something special here. As Hillside's legacy continued to grow, so did its reputation. The neighborhood became known not for its political stances or its individual differences, but for its ability to create a place where all voices were heard. When future generations of Hillside residents looked back, they would see more than just houses and streets. They would see a community that had learned to listen, to forgive, and to move forward. Years later, when Frank was no longer the one flipping burgers at block parties, he'd look around at the young families moving in, each one with its own hopes, dreams, and ideas. And he would know, without a doubt, that they would continue the legacy he had helped build, that they would, in their own way, create a Hillside that was even stronger, even more united than the one he had known. The story of Frank and Sharon, of the MAGA sign that started a firestorm, is not just a tale of political disagreement. It is a story about human resilience, about how communities can be tested and torn apart, but also how they can rise from those challenges, stronger than before. At the heart of it all is a simple truth. People are complicated, and so are communities. But with enough effort, enough understanding, and enough willingness to listen, even the deepest divides can be bridged. In the end, Hillside became more than a neighborhood. It became a living, breathing testament to what happens when people choose to come together.